Và ngay sau đây, hội thảo sẽ tiếp tục với phiên tổng thể thứ nhất. Phiên tổng thể này sẽ tập trung vào chủ đề của sự chuyển dịch xã hội, một nội dung có ý nghĩa đặc biệt quan trọng trong nghiên cứu kinh tế phát triển và hoạch định chính sách. Sau đây, ban tổ chức xin trân trọng kính mời tiến sĩ Bùi Thị Minh Tâm sẽ điều hành phiên tổng thể. Xin trân trọng kính mời tiến sĩ Bùi Thị Minh Tâm và xin quý vị nồng nhiệt chào đón.
Focus on social mobilities, a topic that critical, important in the global economist and policy makers. And we join welcoming Dr. Bùi Thị Minh Tâm on stage.
My name is Nguyen and I'm from the Faculty of Economics, Sixteenth University in Bangkok, Thailand. As you can tell from my name, I'm 100% Vietnamese and proud to be Vietnamese. So I'm very delighted today to be here today for the first time at Nguyen University of Economics and Business Administration. And even more than that, it's my great pleasure and great honor to chair the first keynote session of the 16th VEAM conference featuring Professor Dr. McKay from the University of Sussex in the UK. Professor Andy is a professor of development economics at the University of Sussex, where he has been working since 2006. Teaching development economics for a master's student and undergraduate, and at the same time supervising many PhD theses. His research focuses on labor and gender, poverty and living standard, trade and agriculture, among other areas, with a strong geographical focus on sub-Saharan Africa and also Asia. So he has published extensively in academic journals, co-edited 3 books, and been the guest editor for 4 journal special issues in this area. And recently he has led and also co-led the research project on female labor issue, especially the informal employment of women in Africa and also Asia. So yes, you may know that Andy has visited Vietnam several times, right? And I guess it's your first time in Thailand, I presume. Even he worked extensively on Vietnam, particularly through the Vietnam Access Resources and Household Survey, the VAS, that I guess many of you may know pretty well. The data he uses is 2008 until 2018. So he contributed to 2 co-authored book chapters based on this data set in the book edited by Professor Viet, which is also a familiar name to many of you. The book is called Growth and Structural Transformation and World Change in Vietnam, a rising dragon on the roof, which were published by Oxford University Press in 2017, I guess. Actually, Andy has been a managing director of the Review Development for more than 10 years, since 2015, and recently the journal have changed to have a bigger team of editors, which is 4. And in this occasion, we are lucky we have 2 of them here. So after this event, there will be 2 writing workshops, as Dr. Ngọc Anh already mentioned, on the 11th and 12th. And Andy and another editor will be there if you want to meet them. So since 2024, he also has been an affiliated professor at the University Mohammed VI Polytechnic in Morocco. So beyond academia, Andy has also been a policy advisor to many bilateral governments, which is the FID of the international organizations in many developing countries as well. Right now, currently, Andy is looking on the issue of social mobility in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa and also Asia, including the case of Vietnam. So today, Andy will deliver a lecture on approaches to study social mobility with initial evidence for Vietnam. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Andy McKay.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a real pleasure for me to be at my first VEAM conference. I first started working in Vietnam about the time of the first VEAM conference, but it's the first time I've actually been along to a VEAM conference. But I've followed the VEAM conferences from afar, from the websites, and I have seen it growing and becoming a very successful and impactful conference. It's an honor for me to be invited. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. Thank you very much to Hue University, TUEBA for their hospitality, and I very much appreciate the opportunity. What I'd like to talk to you today about is the question of social mobility, as Tam has introduced. This is a subject I presented on earlier in the year in Africa, where I did a presentation on social mobility in Africa. But this is an important issue in lots of countries, and I think also in the case of Vietnam. So in the course of this talk, I'd like to first of all just motivate why I think social mobility is important, including in the case of Vietnam. I'd like to give some sort of general discussion about social mobility and approaches to thinking about social mobility. I'd like to review a little bit some evidence from a couple of studies in Africa, because I think we can learn useful lessons from that. And then, of course, most importantly, I'd like to talk about potential lessons and implications for Vietnam, including taking stock of some studies that have previously been done. Quickly, just the case for social mobility in Vietnam. The success of Vietnam in growth terms is very well known. It's been taking some data from an OECD economic survey earlier this year. The impressive growth performance of Vietnam for ever since the mid-1980s, and the rapid growth of its GDP per capita. Vietnam has been a country which has been well managed in macroeconomic terms, with manageable debt levels, with reasonable level of taxation, with big success in international trade. At the beginning of that period on that graph, it was not such a big contributor to world trade. Now it's become very big, and it's overtaken other countries like Philippines and Malaysia and so on in terms of its engagement in world trade. Not only that, it's trading with lots of places, it's trading lots of goods, and trade has been a big part of its success. It has also been a big success, as everyone here well knows, in terms of poverty reduction. If we look back to the early 90s, the level of poverty in the country were high. It's now reduced substantially. It has been a major success in terms of reducing poverty, and compared to some other Asian countries, we have comparisons there with Philippines, Indonesia and so on, poverty levels are substantially lower in Vietnam. And it's not just monetary poverty. We look at multidimensional poverty, if we look at Walesa's judgments of poverty, Vietnam has substantially reduced poverty according to whatever way we measure it. Vietnam did have a period when inequality increased, but that's also been brought under control in more recent years. The left chart there is the Gini coefficient. The right chart is the ratio of the income of the top quintile compared to the lowest quintile. Both of those measures of inequality have fallen in recent years. That's too small a chart to show, but that shows inequality in different countries. Vietnam is somewhere in the left of the diagram, and that's 2018 data. Inequality is even lower than that now. So, by Asian comparisons, inequality levels in Vietnam are quite low. In the World Happiness Report, Vietnam gets a good ranking. So, in all these measures, Vietnam has been quite impressive. Vietnam has records that many countries will envy. Of course, there's some issues, and one issue is that there is still significant inequality. There is, for example, significant regional inequality. We can see comparisons there between incomes in different parts of Vietnam, and we see that even though urban-rural inequality seems to have reduced, income levels are significantly lower in, for example, the highland regions. Poverty is reduced substantially, but there's evidence still of persistent poverty. Now, the table there is a very old study from 2002, dated from 2002 and 2006, but what that showed was that there was quite a bit of persistent poverty, people that were stuck in poverty. Now, the extent of that chronic or persistent poverty is substantially reduced. But even that recent study referred to there shows that what persistent poverty there is typically among the agricultural households, ethnic minorities, and remote areas. There's still persistent poverty in Vietnam, and it's still important. Now, persistent poverty is thinking about the dynamics of poverty and the changes in poverty over time. Social mobility, though, is thinking not just about poverty, but thinking about the whole distribution. Thinking about how living conditions are changing across the entire distribution. And it's not just in terms of income that we can think in terms of social mobility. There are many other areas where we can think about social mobility. It's an issue that's been studied in quite a lot of disciplines. Sociology has a long tradition of work on social mobility. It's been studied quite a lot more in richer countries, but it's also been studied in Vietnam, and I'm going to come later to talk about some of the existing studies for Vietnam. I think there's significant scope to build on what's being done. So what do we mean by social mobility? We're interested in the mobility of individuals and households across the entire distribution. Now, a good resource there's a book that was produced by Nguyen in Helsinki on social mobility in about 2017. And it's actually available open access, so you can access the book just from the website. And there's chapters on many aspects of social mobility. It talks about the theory and concepts of social mobility. It talks about types of mobility. It talks about measurement and methods. It talks about drivers and inhibitors of social mobility. And it draws on perspectives from different disciplines. So there's contributions from different disciplines, from history, from anthropology, from sociology, and other disciplines. It's a good resource, and some of the things I say initially will draw a little bit on insights from this volume. Now, social mobility is also linked to something I just talked about, which is inequality. And there's quite a lot of evidence that where inequality is higher, social mobility is lower. Now, we probably shouldn't be surprised by that. There's this phenomenon that's been called the Great Gatsby curve, This is a cross-country plot, and what we're seeing on the horizontal axis is inequality measured by the Gini coefficient. On the vertical axis is intergenerational mobility of earnings, and it's quite a wide scatter, but there's definitely an upward sloping relationship. More inequality is associated with less mobility. The intergenerational earnings mobility there's mobility reduces moving upwards. There's probably a two-way relationship between inequality and intergenerational mobility. Where there's high inequality, there's limited intergenerational mobility, but the limited intergenerational mobility itself contributes to the high inequality. Low intergenerational mobility is also associated with inequality of opportunity. Now, we think often in terms of inequality of outcomes, like income, but there's also an important concept of inequality of opportunity. The opportunities that people have, not just the outcomes they get, but the opportunities they have. Low intergenerational mobility is typically associated with limited inequality of opportunity. So far, we've been talked a bit about intergenerational mobility, but we can also think about intra-generational mobility, mobility over shorter time periods as well. And we're going to talk about both of these. So, the concepts in that book that I just talked about, there's a chapter by Gary Fields, which is quite a comprehensive discussion of measures of social mobility. And he talks about different things. Well, first of all, mobility of what? What are the outcomes that we're interested in? Now, we think of income, or consumption, or whatever, but it could be wealth, it could be occupation, it could be education, it could be social class. All of these things, mobility applies to them. We can think, as I said a minute ago, about different time horizons. Intergenerational, so parents compared to their children, but also intra-generational changes over periods of a few years. We can think about it at a macro level, sort of country levels. Some countries are more mobile than others. But we can think about it at a micro level. Some individuals have more mobility than others as well. We can think about mobility in absolute terms and also in relative terms. Upward absolute mobility will generally be associated with reduction of poverty. Upward relative social mobility should be associated with reducing inequality of opportunity. Both the intergenerational and the intra-generational matter, but typically we're going to be using different data sources. And that limits, that often influences what's possible. For intra-generational mobility, longitudinal or panel data are particularly attractive. Now, panel data are not perfect. Following the same people over time is nice, but there are limitations to such data. But it is a good source to look at intergenerational mobility. Dan talked about that I worked a lot with the VARS household survey in Vietnam, which of course is good, quite long-term panel data. So it's suitable for looking at this intergenerational mobility. With that, we can think about mobility in sort of short to medium term. Intergenerational mobility is about comparisons between parents and children. This is longer term mobility. And typically this is going to come from different data sources. The types of things we can look at, the types of outcomes we can look at, are sometimes different between the intergenerational and the intra-generational. But in whatever case, we should be interested in the different dimensions of mobility. We should be interested in the extent of mobility and its patterns. We should be interested in the enablers and correlates of mobility. we should be interested in how the different types of mobility relate to each other. Intergenerational studies often focus a lot on education and occupations and how they change from parents to children. Now, these are things that perhaps change more slowly. People's education levels change fairly slowly because they don't go back to school all the time. So once they've achieved a certain education level, they probably stay at that level. People don't change their occupations probably very much. These are things that change more slowly. But these are things that can definitely differ between parents and children. So those issues are often studied with intergenerational mobility. Some studies have looked at income, and in particular movement between income quintiles, for example, over this time scale as well. If we look at intragenerational and the sort of time scales of panel data, education and occupation probably change more slowly. And a lot of the intragenerational focuses more on income and mobility of income over that period. We can also look at education, we can also look at occupation, but often it focuses more on income. Now, what's the reason for thinking about intergenerational mobility? The parental background can be an important factor influencing the chances of an individual, of a younger person. So parents can give children an advantage through social connections, through facilitating access to education or jobs because of connections that the parents have. Parents can influence life chances by the environment in which children are brought up, the sort of investments that they get, the sort of skills that they learn, their motivations, their attitudes and beliefs can come from their parents. And of course there can be important genetic aspects to this, that parents can influence children's life chances through genetic transmission, ability, preferences, attitudes, and so on. There's quite a lot of reasons why the situation of the parents is quite likely to influence the children. I talked already about the Gatsby curve, and that's another plot of just intergenerational earnings mobility against inequality. Again, moving upwards is less mobility, so less mobility with greater inequality in the Gini coefficient. We can look at how it relates to inequality of opportunity. That's in absolute terms, that's in relative terms. In all cases, increased inequality is associated with less mobility. From the same wider book, there's a chapter which looks at factors that can contribute to social immobility. And it sets out a model of intertemporal mobility which relates child outcomes to characteristics of parents. And that by itself, through inheritance, through endowments and other factors, already leads to quite a lot of immobility. But other factors can add to that. Segmented labour markets, imperfect credit and insurance markets, just risk itself, limited information. All of these factors can contribute to social immobility. We may get more immobility, therefore, in poorer countries. How to assess social mobility? Often, one simple approach is just by regressing the child outcomes on the parents. So, the Y1 on the right-hand side is the education, occupation, whatever of the child, regressed on the parents. And the coefficient beta1 is an intergenerational regression coefficient. The higher the coefficient, the more the correlation, the more the association, the less the mobility. Or we can simply look at a correlation between the child and the parent outcomes, an intergenerational correlation coefficient, which is related to the beta 1 in the top equation, but then the standard deviations of the outcomes for the parents and the child come into play. What sort of data can we use to look at social mobility? We can often get data from cross-sectional surveys. Censuses and household surveys are widely used. And censuses can be used, or household surveys can be used to compare co-resident parents and children who live in the same household and are therefore surveyed at the same time together. Information on the parent and the children is available. And so they can be compared and look at social mobility. Now, of course, children don't stay in the same household forever. Children grow up and leave and so on. So that's important. So that limits the age range in which we can make the comparison. So if we're comparing education of children and parents, we maybe need to be looking at children in the sort of 14 to 18 age range who may have completed their junior secondary or their primary education and compare it with the situation of the parents. But there's a co-residence requirement. Now, most children have probably stayed in the household until age 18 or whatever. After that, they may have left. But there is a co-residence, and that sort of creates a selectivity. It limits the sample in which we can make this comparison. Because we can't look at 5-year-old children because they haven't completed their education. It's even more difficult when we think about occupations because children may often start working after they've left the household. Some surveys have questions about the occupation or the education of absent parents who are no longer in the household, and that then makes the comparison easier. Some innovative surveys actually ask questions about the household in which people were when they were children. What were the characteristics of the household in which they grew up? They've moved to another household now, but they have information in the childhood household. And that allows a wider range of comparisons. I'll show you an example in a bit. A lot of the intergenerational focuses on education, some of it on occupation. Panel data is, of course, longitudinal data is, of course, the way to look at intra-generational mobility. As I already said, education and occupation probably change more slowly. Income, consumption is probably more volatile. Being able to track the same people is good. Being able to see mobility of an individual is a good thing. But panel data has its limitations. There are significant measurement errors, especially things like income and consumption. And because we're often focusing on changes between one wave and another, those measurement errors have an even bigger impact. Panels suffer from attrition, from people dropping out, and usually that attrition is systematic. It's very nice if we can track people that move, because often migration, moving, is a way that people can get opportunities, or sometimes they move because they're responding to an adverse shock. But being able to track the people that move is important. Panels also often cover quite short time periods. But there are more panels that cover multiple waves. There are more panels that cover longer periods of time. And there are some panel surveys which track people that move. When we think about mobility and education, how do we measure them? Education is often measured in terms of years of schooling or having attained a certain level of education, like completed primary school, completed junior secondary, or whatever. Labour outcomes are often the quality of the occupation, the nature of the work, self-employment or wage work, formal sector or not, the skills that the work requires, and so on. And income is often assessed in terms of its level, maybe in terms of its quantiles. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about some international evidence, talk about some Africa evidence, and then come to the case of Vietnam. So briefly, I'll talk about an international resource. The World Bank has recently produced an international study and created a global database on intergenerational inequality, mobility. There's data in many countries, and referred to in the paper that there's the link. We have country-level estimates of intergenerational mobility in income and also in education. That map shows the estimates of intergenerational mobility in income. The red colours show less mobility. The green colours show greater mobility. There is data for Vietnam. We can see there, it's a dark colour of green, so it's relatively mobile compared to, for example, countries in South America, compared to China, compared to India, and so on. The estimated mobility is greater. There's also quite a strong association between educational mobility and income mobility, revealed in this study. I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the case of Africa and just choose on a couple of studies. And the first study I'm choosing is a study by esteemed authors, including Alessina, which looks at education mobility in Africa, and which is published in a very good journal, Econometric. So a paper on social mobility published in a very good journal, we should pay some attention to it. So what do? They have data from 27 countries in Africa. They take data from population censuses. IPOM's, a resource in the US, presents samples of 10% or 5% samples of population censuses. These censuses have information and education available for many countries, often in multiple waves. For these 27 countries, they have data from 69 censuses, mostly from the 1980s onwards. Countries covered 850 million people in 2015, about 3/4 of the African population. The data allows a geographic disaggregation within countries. They have education data for about 93 million individuals, but they want to focus on those that are aged 14 and above, because what we want to do is compare the education with co-resident parents. And their focus is primary school completion. Levels of education in Africa are low. Completing primary education, rates of completed primary education, especially among parents, are often quite low. So in Vietnam, one might want a higher threshold. For Africa, this is not about threshold. The expectation is that if people complete primary school, they will have done it by the age of 14, so we can focus on 14 to 18-year-old children, see how many of them have completed primary school, and compare with the parents. They do look at different education categories, but the main focus is on primary completion. And the focus is on absolute mobility, and what they're interested in is children who completed primary school when their parents didn't. And that's a measure of upward mobility. A measure of downward mobility is children who did not complete primary education, although their parents did. Now that's a poor look across the 27 countries and all the different censuses. And on the horizontal axis is the education level of the parents, less than primary, completed secondary, completed tertiary. Vertically is the equivalent for the children. Now, we still see among the children, many of them still have less than primary, but quite a few less than is the case on the horizontal axis. There is definitely upward mobility in this data. Many more children are completing primary school than their parents did. There's variation across countries, so we have on the left Mozambique, where the education levels are very low and there's not so much upward mobility. We have here Tanzania, where there's much more upward mobility. So there's quite a bit of variation across countries. They estimate regressions for upward mobility and downward mobility, basically using a series of fixed effects and so on, interested in looking at, and in the end, the factors that correlate with upward mobility. That's, of course, data which is far too small to see, but what we have is a ranking of countries by high upward mobility down to low upward mobility, and we see a big variation from South Africa and Botswana at the top to Mozambique and South Sudan at the bottom. And of course, where we have lower upward mobility, we have greater downward mobility. They also look at mobility within countries. So the yellow colours and the lighter colours are associated with more upward mobility, and we see that quite a lot in particular districts. This is in the case of Ghana, in the south, where there's much more upward mobility. In the north, there's much less upward mobility. The right-hand map is downward mobility. Yellow is lower levels. The darker colours are lower levels of downward mobility. And again, we see that more in the south. So we've got quite a lot of variation. They look at the association between the literacy of the parents having completed primary school, and upward mobility. The more educated are the parents, the more is the upward mobility, the less is the downward mobility. And then they look at factors that correlate with mobility. So, they find that those that are closest to the coast, those that are closest to the capital city, those in areas with lower malaria, those in areas with more rugged terrain, have got more upward mobility. There are historical factors, colonial roads and railways associated with more mobility, missionary activity associated with more mobility, areas where they didn't find much of an impact of natural resources, which is often talked about a lot in Africa. Sometimes people get upward mobility by being in well-endowed locations with good infrastructure. Sometimes they get mobility by moving to an area with greater infrastructure. Migration also matters. The second study I'd like to talk about is an unpublished study, but a nice study in the case of Mozambique. And I'm picking this study because this is a survey which specifically, first of all, has information on the education and occupation of absent parents, which not all surveys do. And second, it has information on the childhood household, the households in which children grew up. And so, it's not a nationally representative sample, it's in specific locations, but as I say, they did collect information. Now this is a nice diagram or representation of mobility, and this is what's called the Sankey diagram, and basically we have different levels of education, so no education, less than primary, the green one is lower primary, the red one is higher primary, and so on. And what we see on the left are the parents. And what the diagram shows on the right is what the children, the level of education the children of those parents were able to achieve. Now, 41% of the cases where the parents have no education, the children don't either. But quite a lot of the children show upward mobility. So quite a lot of the children, 13%, move from no education to less than primary. 22% move from low education to lower primary. So there's quite a bit of mobility. There's quite a bit of upward mobility in education, shown in the case of Mozambique. They also look at mobility in terms of occupations. They classify occupations into formally employed, informal, and agriculture. And within informal and agriculture, they have what they call an upper tier and the lower tier. So agriculture, which is, for example, more engaged in selling, and agriculture, which is subsistence, more profitable or less profitable informal activities. Here, there's a lot of movement, but there's not any clear upward or downward mobility. Now, because they have information of the children's households, they can compare the poverty of the households in which people are currently living with the households in which they were children. And what they find is that they do a sort of multi-dimensional type poverty measure, and what they find is that when the children's household was poor, they are currently much more likely to be in poverty. When the child's household was not poor, they're much less likely to be in poverty. There's important mobility, important persistence. Okay, that's about after. But we're in Vietnam. So what can we learn from Vietnam? What can we say about social mobility in Vietnam? Now, I'm not going to present any results of my own. I've done a little bit of looking at the recent DHLSS, but what I'm actually going to do is briefly refer to some existing studies which have been done. But first, let's just think about possible sources of data. Vietnam is quite well off in terms of sources of data. Of course, you've got population censuses, and that gives comprehensive coverage of the population. That's got information on some information, education, occupation. But of course, we've got the co-residence issue. We can only do it for co-resident population. But the population census is a resource that we could use to look at social mobility. The VHLSS is well known to, I'm sure, everyone here. There has lots of information on education, occupation, income, consumption, and everything. It's every 2 years. It's got short panels and so on. It's a very good source of data, but it doesn't have that question about the education and occupation of absent parents. So to some extent, when we're doing the intergenerational, the co-residence requirement is going to be relevant there as well. The VAST survey, the survey I've worked quite a lot with, is a long-term panel data set. So we have a long-term panel data covering 2008 to 16, extend that back to 2006, and then tracks the same people. And so we can see mobility. And one of the chapters in that book I did was on welfare dynamics. But this also doesn't have the question of absent parents. So for the intergenerational, that we still have the co-residence. But this is a good source on intra-generational, except that, of course, it's not nationally representative. It's only in the locations where the survey was done. But for intra-generational purposes, it's important. The Young Life survey was done in Vietnam, and this interviewed children born around the millennium, and some 7-year-olds at the time, and then followed them through 5 waves. That then is longitudinal data covering the periods. The last survey, I think, there was phone surveys in the early, around the COVID time, but the last survey, I think, was about 2015-16. But these surveyed the households as well as the children. This is longitudinal data. We can get information on these, on the things that we're interested in the social mobility for. But of course it's selective. It's not representative. It's quite focused on children. There is information of the parents as well, but it's selective. We have mixed surveys, the units have mixed surveys. These are done repeatedly. They've got information, education, work, and so on. The cross-sectional surveys, though, and probably here as well, the co-residence issue applies for the intergenerational mobility. There's other surveys, the TVSEP survey and others. There's quite a lot of data available for Vietnam. And actually, quite a lot of work has been done on social mobility in Vietnam. And there's a list of some papers that I've identified. That's not comprehensive, but there are some interesting and good quality studies here. Some of these have looked at intergenerational mobility. Some have looked at intra-generational mobility. I have some slides on these papers. I'm going to just go quite quickly through it. An early study by Emran and Shilpi looked at Vietnam and Nepal together and looked at intergenerational mobility from agriculture to non-agriculture. More mobility in Vietnam than Nepal, less for women. The second study looks at intergenerational income mobility in Vietnam. This is a father-son comparison, except that, and for 5 surveys, VLSS and VHLSS surveys, but they're not using fathers and sons together. They have to do representative fathers matched with the sons, using a technique called two-stage least squares. They regress son's income on the predicted income of the father. They find a coefficient of about 0.48, which is sort of intermediate in terms of mobility. So that shows a reasonable degree of upward mobility. Compared to other developing countries, that's not too bad a level of mobility. They did quantile regressions. They suggested that there's less mobility at the bottom of the distribution. They looked at education mobility, very high persistence of education at the top, but quite a bit of upward mobility at the bottom. Again, we have charts. I'll leave the slides as you can look at them another time. A study by Dang looks at earnings and income mobility. This is a regression just to estimate the intergenerational elasticity using, again, VHLSS data and data from the VLSS, using the same technique as the paper we just saw. They compare sons and daughters with the fathers. They find more mobility for the girls, for the daughters, than for the sons. Again, the level of mobility is reasonably high. This is a nice study which looks at the impact of a trade agreement with the US, 2001 BTA agreement on intergenerational occupational mobility. And they use every VHLSS between 2002 and 2016. They create father-son pairs and mother-daughter pairs. They classify the occupations into sort of 8 categories, which they think they can rank: better quality versus less good quality. Descriptive analysis shows a lot of persistence. If we look at this, these are kids that are born to fathers or mothers who are at the top of the occupational distribution. Where do they end up in occupations? At the top. Not many of them end up in lower quality occupation. The ones born to fathers and mothers at the bottom of the distribution, where do they end up? At the bottom. Not many of them end up in higher occupations. So a lot of persistence in terms of occupations. A more careful econometric analysis does show, though, that there is significant upward mobility, and more so for the mother-daughter pairs. They show more upward mobility. They say that there's increased demand for college education, increased demand for skills, particularly among women, because of the export activities favoured the employment of women. That chart shows how upward mobility changed over time for the son-father and the mother-daughter pair. The solid line there in the middle of the diagram is the increase in upward mobility. We see it for both. It's probably bigger, the increase for the daughter and mother. So there is evidence of upward mobility, and there is evidence of increasing upward mobility. Other studies looked at the intra-generational mobility. This is an earlier study which looked at the impact of globalization on intra-generational mobility in labour and in income using VHLSS data and exploiting the panel. They look at labour mobility in terms of movements between self-employment and wage, there's not much of that. They look at movement between sectors, agriculture, industry and services. There's some movement, but most people stay in the same sector in these periods. They look at movement between skill categories. There's some evidence of people moving into more skilled categories. They look at income mobility by decile. There's some social mobility, but there's not much evidence that structural change is an important driving factor. This is another study that looks at intra-generational mobility, sorry, it says intergenerational slide, it's intra-generational mobility. This uses the VHLSS panels between 2004 and 8 and 2010 and 14. And again, we're looking at mobility. They regress the wages of children and those of parents and so on. Descriptive data shows quite a bit of income mobility. More educated household heads have more mobility. They're more likely to move up. They're less likely to move down. Minorities are less likely to move up, are more likely to move down. Households with more children, more older people, are less mobile. The Southeast shows more mobility than other regions. Mobility in employment, it's the more educated, it's the King Hoa, it's the urban that are more mobile. They're more, and actually females are more likely to have more upward intergenerational mobility. The last study I'd like to refer to is a very interesting study done by Oxfam on social mobility and equality of opportunity in Vietnam. And this uses qualitative evidence as well as quantitative evidence. And some of the qualitative evidence they have is just asking people about what is their understanding of what social mobility means. And they see it as multidimensional, including many different aspects. Yes, income, employment, and occupational issues are important, but so are other things. Family, community, power, and other things. And then they have a quantitative study, they have qualitative study of aspects of social mobility as well, and a quantitative study with the VHLSS data. And some of the messages, not that much occupational mobility. not that much movement from agriculture to non-agriculture. Quite a few people moving from non-agriculture back to agriculture. Often the non-agricultural jobs were actually not what people expected, were not good quality jobs, and people preferred to move back to agriculture. There's quite a lot of educated unemployment, people not finding jobs. There seems to be less intergenerational mobility in the more recent period. There's certainly less upward mobility for ethnic minorities. Intergenerationally, there's some movement from agriculture to non-agriculture, but more in urban areas, more for women, more for adults, and more for the kin, however, compared to the opposites. Intergenerational income mobility, again, higher in those groups. A good analysis of the factors enabling and inhibiting mobility. A good, interesting study, and important because it's an NGO that has important influence and impact. Now, just summarising, not all of these studies are equally good quality and not equally well published, but there has been quite a bit of study already of intergenerational and intra-generational mobility, especially in income and work, not so much actually in education. I think the Oxfam study is very interesting. It's quantitative and qualitative combined, and that is powerful. It has the voice of a non-governmental organisation. That is important. I think there's quite a few consistent messages here about groups that are more and less mobile. The data does have its limitations. This co-residence requirement is an issue, is a challenge. The ability to match parents and children is difficult. The VHLSS covers short time periods. I think the scope for more work in educational mobility. I think the scope for exploiting other sources of data. We haven't seen much in VARS, we haven't seen much in Young Lives and other things. And I think the scope to learn from practices in other countries. And it's a more general issue. And this is true for the whole literature on social mobility. We've sort of analysed intra-generational mobility and intergenerational mobility separately. But how does one affect the other? If there's more intergenerational mobility, does that allow more intra-generational mobility? That's an issue which has not really been studied in this social mobility literature. I think it's an interesting and important question. I think it can be studied. I think there's lots of opportunity to build on what's already been done in Vietnam. I think this is an important and interesting issue, and I think there's lots of scope to build on this. Thank you very much.
Instead of providing a lot of the conceptual framework for the social mobility issues, Andy also refers to an open access book chapter that you can always read later. But especially that you compare the case of African countries and some initial study in the case of Vietnam. I really love the way that you separate the inter and intra generational mobility, and also the requirement of data, right? Whether we can explore that kind of mobility in the short run, medium run, or in the longer term. And that would definitely require a lot of data. And it is very fortunate that Vietnam has quite a bit of data for you to explore. You also mentioned a lot of things about like the different dimensions of social mobility, including gender and regional dimension. And I think for the case of Vietnam, it's also important that you look at like a different groups. For example, the ethnic minority people, and between men and women, we have like a different level of social mobility. So, and you also cite out some open questions that maybe motivate us to, and the young scholar here to explore further. So now I would like to open the Q&A session for participants from the floor. So you want to have any questions? So Professor Minh, can you pass the mic? Actually, we start this session 10 minutes later than scheduled, so I would like them to have like about 5 more minutes. So we make this at 10 past 10.
Thank you, Professor McKay. What a wonderful opener. I just want to bring you a couple of small issues. My understanding of your studies. One, first, in economic analysis, we often distinguish between the end and the means. In that context, I like to focus on education. Education is both an indicator of social mobility and also a means of achieving social mobility. So it plays a double role. It's unlike other. So what is your informed expert view on that? And secondly, do you perceive that we could have international study of social mobility and look at interesting factors such as, say, the level of corruption and the determinant of social mobility? Thank you.
And did you want to collect some questions one by one? A couple more, yes. You can be the next.
Thank you, Andre. It's extremely rich keynote presentation. I learned a lot. I have one comment and one question. The comment is that looking at the literature on social mobility, not only of Vietnam or other countries, one missing piece is that the majority of the studies, nearly 90% of the studies, ignore the issue of kind of initial endogeneity. Perhaps except for allegiance recent studies like the cultural factors, the geographical factors, historical factors. I think this is necessary part, particularly for the Vietnam. So this is a comment. And the second one is a question and a comment. So based on your kind of rich survey of the social mobility studies, what can you tell as a policy implication for the Vietnamese government? So after listening to your talk, so I think that educating the parents is the most important, not only for education themselves, but also realizing that education is important. If the parents, the generations are educated by themselves, they know the importance of the education. However, so if the parent generation increase the relatively younger generations are not educated, they don't realize the importance of education. So that's why they are trying to send their children a little bit earlier to the labor market. I think that probably is the most important question. Because, but if you have any other views, so please let us know.
Một bạn ngồi bên đấy luôn, cẩn thận vướng. Một bạn ngồi bên đấy. Mỗi người bên.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. So in Vietnam, we achieve a lot of achievement in poverty reduction, right? So that's kind of absolute mobility. But here we have relative and intergenerational mobility. So that topic is quite interesting for our more equitable and sustainable future, right? So regarding the question by Ismail, I think that's the problem of endogeneity. The thing here is that we can't have a kind of reverse causality here, right? Because we can't teach our parents, right? We can't make our parents have more education, right? But I just wondering about the mechanism, right? Mechanism. Why would you believe that higher education mother or father would have higher education child, right? So that's my question.
Would you like to have the first three questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the expose. My question is, in the end, what's the utility of mobility in international or intra or intergenerational? Does it? Is there any study who measures the contribution of mobility to either gross domestic product or maybe gross domestic happiness?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to build on that last question. You talked a lot about the causes of intergenerational mobility, but I was wondering about the consequences of it. You talked a little bit about the relationship between inequality and mobility. So that's one potential consequence, but I was wondering if there's other consequences. And I wanted you to, maybe if you could pitch that in the differences between Vietnam and China, which I noticed were very striking. China was very high in terms of lack of mobility, Vietnam was much lower. So I wondered if you could spell out what those consequences are in terms of those two countries.
Thank you. I think we have only one more question and then Andy. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, for the interesting talk. I enjoyed it a lot. And I learned a lot from staff as well, especially in terms of getting the data for future research and for Vietnam in particular. So I looked at the picture that you presented, right, for African countries and also for a country like Vietnam. So I can see that these countries are different, not only in terms of cultural values, but also in terms of institutions. Yeah, so it was a bit puzzled when you presented, about there's no link between the natural resources and social mobility. Right? So it seems that there's rich literature on resource plus, and that links that with the institution. Right? So I'm just wondering whether you have looked at the impact of institutional quality on social mobility, and in particular in African countries. I'm not sure about the case of Vietnam, but I'm sure that the local institutional quality does have some role and does have some impact.
Okay, so Andy, you have like 7 minutes to answer 6 questions.
Thank you for very good questions, and I'm not sure. Some of them are ones I think I need to think a little bit more about, but they're interesting and important questions. Now, the question about endogeneity, a lot of the focus here is quite descriptive in terms of trying to see what are the patterns of mobility that the data show. So a lot of the focus here, I think, is in sort of describing social mobility that we see in the data, and I think that's important and interesting in its own right. Now, it's not that causation issue doesn't matter, but the descriptive aspect of this, I think, was quite a strong focus of what I said, and I think it's important. Now, of course, the endogeneity matters. Now, the Alessina et al. Study that I talked about tried to look at some of the underlying causes of the mobility, and looked at some of the factors like location and people's movement to areas with better infrastructure, or indeed, as you said, the impact of natural resources and so on. And that's a little bit more of an attempt at trying to look at factors that might be important drivers of mobility. A lot of the Vietnam studies that I talked about are mostly descriptive. They're not particularly looking at deeper underlying causes. Now, the point about education mobility, I think, is different and important. I think is definitely true. Education is an outcome in its own right, and we should be interested in mobility in terms of education anyway. Education is an important outcome in its own right for intrinsic reasons, and we should be interested in mobility in education. But education enables lots of other things, and the education mobility almost certainly can support occupational mobility or income mobility and so on. So it's a fairly fundamental type of mobility which I think is important for other outcomes. So that's definitely the case. It's interesting in its own right, but certainly it's interesting, the association. I mean, we should be interested in the association between these different types of outcomes. International study of social mobility. I mean, the LSE in the paper I presented was an international study, cross-country study of African countries of social mobility and looking at factors. Now, I don't think they looked at corruption, but they did look at different factors, and I think the scope is there to do, but what we need, of course, is comparable data. Now, the census data, censuses are similar in different countries. The IPOMS produces their samples of censuses. We can put together data from different countries, and that could be a basis for doing a cross-country study in, for example, Southeast Asia or Asia more widely, and I think that definitely could be important. Education, I think, as Katushi said, is fundamentally important, and parents achieving a certain level of education definitely enables better outcomes for the children. There was a reference to sort of differences between Africa and Vietnam, and I think that's definitely the case. And one is the level of education. The levels of education are much lower in Africa than is the case in Vietnam. So translating lessons from one part of the world to another, I think, is something we should be a little bit careful about. Policy implications for government. I mean, encouraging mobility, I think. Encouraging mobility that relates to the question about how does mobility affect other things? How does mobility affect GDP? How does mobility affect happiness and so on? There's quite a lot of evidence in migration that quite a lot of migration actually does lead people to be better off. Now, not everybody who migrates is better off as a result, and some people are worse off, but on average, migration is often a way that people can get better off. So again, this is not migration, this is mobility, but again, this may be associated with better outcomes. I don't think it's studied in relation to impact on GDP or impact on happiness and so on, but these are important questions. Consequences of intergenerational mobility, I think, is one thing I'd like to think a little bit more about, but I think it's a good and important question. The lack of impact of natural resources. Well, I mean, natural resources are claimed, although not everybody supports this, to have impacts on economic outcomes. It wasn't found in LSE study to be important for educational mobility, but that doesn't mean it's not important for other types of outcomes and other types of mobility. The focus of that paper was on a very specific theme of educational mobility, and natural resources may well have impacts on other types of mobility. I'm sorry I haven't quite answered every single question, but thank you for the questions.
I think we already reached the time limit, even though I know that you have so many questions. I myself have questions that I have to ask you directly. So thank you very much for your attention and your time. for taking your coffee time, but I hope that you are going to have a refreshing time in a few minutes. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor.
Em gửi cho chị cái bản file mềm ạ. Để em gửi chị.
Ladies and gentlemen, the organizing committee respectfully invites to delegates and Holiscare to take short break and is a refreshment in the reception area. Immediately following the break, the conference will continue with the panel session will be held in different venues, and the schedule is a program. We kindly ask the participants to consult session information and proceed to the point of discussion. Thank you for the kind cooperation.
Kính thưa quý vị đại biểu, quý vị khách quý, ban tổ chức